New York City, a realm of concrete ambition and glass-encased power. Alexander Blackwood had climbed to its pinnacle, not through inheritance but through ruthless determination. At 38, he'd transformed a modest tech startup into Black Edge Industries, a corporate behemoth that consumed competitors like a shark in bloodied waters. His name appeared on Forbes lists, his face on magazine covers, his reputation preceding him in every boardroom across Manhattan. Tonight, the Astor Club's private lounge hosted him and his inner circle, fellow titans of industry unwinding after another week of conquest. The amber glow of expensive whiskey reflected in crystal glasses as cigar smoke curled toward ornate ceilings. Alexander sat at the center of it all, his tailored Tom Ford suit a second skin, his posture relaxed yet commanding. Another acquisition. "This week, Alex?" James Harrington asked, swirling his 20-year-old Macallan. Once Alexander's college roommate at Harvard, now his closest confidant and chief legal counsel. "Welltech Systems," Alexander confirmed with a slight smirk. They thought they could hold out for a better offer. They were wrong. Appreciative chuckles rippled through the group. No one defied Alexander Blackwood and emerged unscathed. His success came from an uncanny ability to identify weaknesses in markets, in systems, in people, and exploit them without mercy. "To the relentless march of progress," toasted Vincent Keller, raising his glass. Old money, old connections, old power. Vincent had known Alexander since their days at Phillips Exeter Academy, their friendship forged in the crucible of adolescent ambition and maintained through strategic mutual benefit. As the night wore on and the alcohol flowed freely, the conversation turned from business to more personal matters. Vincent leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of calculated mischief. "You know what I've been thinking, Alex? You've mastered the art of the deal, but I wonder if your skills extend beyond the boardroom." Alexander's eyebrow arched. "Careful, Vincent. The last person who questioned my abilities now works at a regional bank in Omaha." The group laughed, but Vincent persisted. "Not a question of business acumen, my friend. More, a question of human transformation." "I'm listening." Alexander's interest was piqued despite himself. Vincent gestured to the bartender for another round before continuing. "My father used to tell me stories about Henry Higgins and Eliza Doolittle, the ultimate wager on human potential. I've always wondered if such a thing were possible in our modern world." "You're proposing a bet." Alexander straightened, his competitive nature instantly engaged. "Indeed." Vincent's smile was sharp as a blade. "I bet you cannot take a woman from society's lowest rung, someone truly destitute, uneducated, uncultured, and transform her into someone who could move comfortably in our world. Someone who could attend the Metropolitan Gala without raising a single eyebrow." The table fell silent, all eyes moving between the two men. Alexander's face remained impassive, but his mind raced with calculations. "Parameters?" he asked coolly. 3 months, Vincent replied. "Starting from the moment you select your project. If you succeed, if she can convince the social elite that she belongs among them, I'll give you that parcel of land in the Hamptons you've been eyeing for your next development." Alexander's pulse quickened. That 20-acre waterfront property was the missing piece in his planned luxury resort, a crown jewel Vincent had stubbornly refused to sell. "And if I fail?" "Your new electric vehicle prototype. All patents, all research, all development." Vincent's eyes glittered. "I hear it's quite revolutionary." A collective intake of breath around the table. The EV project was Alexander's pet innovation, potentially worth billions if it succeeded as projected. "You're asking a lot, Vincent." Alexander's voice remained controlled, but those who knew him well could detect the edge of excitement. "I'm asking for what you claim to do best. Reshape reality to your specifications." Vincent leaned back, supremely confident. "Unless, of course, you've lost your touch." The challenge hung in the air, thick as the cigar smoke. Alexander raised his glass, examining the light through the amber liquid. He had never backed down from a challenge, never lost a wager. His entire empire was built on calculated risks. "I accept," he finally said, his voice low but firm. "But I choose the woman." Vincent nodded, satisfaction evident on his aristocratic features. "Of course, though I doubt you'll find many diamonds in the rough sleeping on subway grates. You'd be surprised what I can find when motivated. Alexander drained his glass and rose to his feet. Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have a recruitment mission to attend to. The night air bit at Alexander's face as he exited the club, his driver, holding the door of the sleek black Bentley. Just drive, Marcus, he instructed, settling into the leather seat. Let's tour the less fortunate parts of our fair city. For nearly 2 hours, they cruised through neighborhoods that grew progressively rougher. Alexander's eyes scanned each huddled figure, each desperate face searching for the right canvas for his masterpiece. Not just anyone would do. He needed someone malleable yet with a spark of intelligence, someone beaten down but not broken beyond repair. They were passing through a particularly derelict area in the Bronx when Alexander spotted her. Sitting on a bench beneath a flickering streetlight, a woman sat with remarkable stillness. Unlike the others they'd passed, she wasn't huddled for warmth or begging for change. Despite her ragged clothing and unwashed appearance, she sat with an unusual dignity, her back straight, her gaze fixed on some distant point. "Stop the car," Alexander commanded. Marcus pulled over, his expression concerned. "Sir, this isn't exactly—" "Wait here," Alexander cut him off, stepping out into the cold night. He approached cautiously, aware of the incongruity of his $1,000 shoes on the cracked concrete. As he drew closer, he could see her more clearly. Mid-30s perhaps, though hardship had aged her prematurely. Her face, beneath layers of grime and exhaustion, had a certain symmetry that hinted at beauty long neglected. "Good evening," he said, keeping a respectful distance. The woman's eyes flicked to him, then away. No response. "My name is Alexander." "Blackwood, I'd like to speak with you if you're willing." "I'm not selling anything," she replied, her voice surprisingly clear and articulate. "Not my body, not my story for your charity newsletter." Alexander blinked, taken aback by her directness. "I'm not looking to buy either. I have a proposition of a different nature." "Men like you always do." Her laugh was short, bitter. "What's your angle? Savior complex, tax write-off, reality show?" Before Alexander could respond, 2 security guards from a nearby building approached, eyeing the woman with obvious disdain. "Ma'am, we've told you before, no loitering," one said gruffly. "Move along or we'll have to call the police." Alexander stepped forward, his presence suddenly commanding. "That won't be necessary, she's with me." The guards hesitated, taking in his expensive attire and authoritative tone. "Sir, this woman has been causing disturbances." "I said," Alexander repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous octave. "She's with me." After a tense moment, the guards backed away, muttering apologies. Alexander turned back to the woman, expecting gratitude or at least relief. Instead, her eyes, a startling amber color he now noticed, fixed on him with unsettling intensity. "You will regret this," she said quietly. "Regret what?" Alexander asked, intrigued rather than deterred. "Whatever game you're playing." She stood, gathering a small worn backpack. "People aren't pawns, Mr. Blackwood, no matter how powerful you think you are." Alexander smiled, his decision made. This was no ordinary homeless woman. There was something here, intelligence, defiance, and most importantly, a mystery he suddenly felt compelled to unravel. "I'm offering you a chance," he said. 3 months of shelter, food, clothing, and education. In return, you attend one event with me at the end of that period. After that, you can walk away with enough money to start a new life." She studied him, suspicion evident in every line of her body. "Why me?" "Because you intrigue me," he answered honestly, "and because I never lose a bet." Her expression tightened at the mention of a bet, but she glanced at the darkening sky, at the hostile guards watching from a distance. Whatever calculations she was making behind those amber eyes, survival seemed to win out. "I have conditions," she said. Alexander nearly laughed. A homeless woman with conditions. Name them. "My personal space is respected. No cameras, no publicity. I can leave at any time." "Agreed." And I want to know your real reason, not tonight, but eventually. Alexander extended his hand. Eventually. Do we have a deal, Ms. She hesitated, then clasped his hand firmly. Elena Ward. As they walked toward the waiting Bentley, neither of them noticed Vincent Keller's black Aston Martin parked discreetly at the end of the block, its occupant watching with cold interest through tinted windows. The Bentley purred through the night, crossing invisible boundaries between worlds. Elena sat rigid in the leather seat, her worn backpack clutched to her chest like armor. She refused to show awe at the vehicle's luxury, though her fingers occasionally brushed the smooth surface of the door panel when she thought Alexander wasn't looking. They drove in silence, the city's chaos giving way to the manicured tranquility of the Upper East Side. When the car finally turned into a private driveway, Elena's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Alexander's home, a historic brownstone mansion renovated to perfection, its limestone facade glowing warmly under tasteful lighting. Home sweet home, Alexander said, watching her reaction. Carefully, Elena composed her features. Quite the fortress. Inside, the grandeur was understated but unmistakable. Original moldings framed soaring ceilings, a sweeping staircase curved gracefully upward. Art that Elena recognized as museum-worthy adorned the walls, a Rothko here, a small Matisse there. Mrs. Collins, Alexander called, and a woman in her 60s appeared, her silver hair in a neat bun, her expression one of practiced neutrality. Upon seeing Elena's disheveled state, "This is Elena Ward. She'll be staying with us for the next 3 months. Please prepare the blue guest suite and arrange for Dr. Patel to visit tomorrow morning." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood." Mrs. Collins's British accent was crisp. "Would Ms. Ward care for some refreshment before retiring?" Before Eleanor could respond, her stomach growled audibly. A flush crept up her neck. "I believe that answers your question," Alexander said with a slight smile. "Something substantive, please, Mrs. Collins." "Right away, sir." Alexander led Elena to an elegant dining room. "Mrs. Collins has been with me since I purchased this house, completely trustworthy and discreet." "Unlike her employer," Elena murmured. Alexander's eyebrow arched. "You don't trust me." Wise, but unnecessary in this case. A man who collects strangers from street corners rarely has pure intentions. "I never claimed purity of intention." Alexander took a seat across from her. "Only honesty about the arrangement." Mrs. Collins returned with a tray bearing a steaming bowl of soup, fresh bread, and a glass of water. Elena inhaled the aroma of the soup, French onion, rich and savory, but made no move to eat. "It's not poisoned," Alexander said dryly. "That's exactly what a poisoner would say." But hunger won out and Eleanor lifted the spoon. She ate with surprising restraint and precision, belying her circumstances. No desperate gulping, no licking the bowl clean. Her posture remained proper, her movements deliberate. Alexander watched with growing fascination. "You've known better days," he observed. Elena dabbed her mouth with the napkin. "Everyone has, even you, I suspect." "Where did you learn to eat like that?" "Like what?" "Like someone who knows which fork to use for the fish course." Elena's eyes met his, challenging. "Perhaps I read etiquette books at the public library, or maybe I'm a deposed aristocrat. Does it matter to your project?" Alexander leaned forward. "Everything about you matters to my project." Something flickered in Elena's expression, wariness, perhaps, or resignation. She set down her spoon, the bowl half finished. "I'd like to shower now, if that's part of our arrangement." Mrs. Collins reappeared to escort Elena upstairs. The blue guest suite was larger than any apartment Eleanor had ever occupied, with a king-sized bed, sitting area, and a bathroom of gleaming marble. Mrs. Collins showed her how to operate the rainfall shower, placed fresh toiletries on the counter, and indicated a silk robe hanging on the door. "I'll have some appropriate attire delivered tomorrow," Mrs. Collins said. "In the meantime, there are clean nightclothes in the dresser. Will there be anything else, Miss Ward?" Elena shook her head, words suddenly beyond her. When Mrs. Collins had gone, Elena stood motionless in the center of the room, absorbing its opulence, its safety, its temporary nature. Then, methodically, she explored every inch, checking window, locks, inspecting smoke detectors for cameras, testing the door's solidity. Satisfied, she finally allowed herself the luxury of the shower, standing under the hot spray until her skin turned pink and years of grime swirled down the drain. Later, wrapped in the silk robe, she examined her reflection in the bathroom's expansive mirror. Without the protective layer of dirt and hardship, her features emerged. High cheekbones, a straight nose, full lips now chapped but still well-shaped. Her hair, when clean, revealed itself as a rich auburn rather than the dull brown it had appeared on the street. She looked younger, almost recognizable to herself. The thought brought no comfort. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Eleanor opened the door cautiously to find Mrs. Collins with a tray of tea. "Mr. Blackwood thought you might have trouble sleeping in a new environment," the housekeeper explained. "Chamomile with honey." Eleanor accepted the tray with murmured thanks. After Mrs. Collins departed, she sniffed the tea suspiciously before taking a tentative sip. The warmth spread through her chest, unleashing a wave of exhaustion she could no longer fight. She barely made it to the bed before sleep claimed her. Morning. Arrived with sunlight streaming through windows, someone had quietly unshuttered while she slept. Elena bolted upright, momentarily disoriented by the softness beneath her, the cleanness of the air she breathed. Reality reassembled itself piece by piece, the bet, the billionaire, the bargain she'd struck. A discreet knock announced Mrs. Collins, bearing another tray. "Good morning, Ms. Ward. Mr. Blackwood requests your presence downstairs at 10 o'clock, after you've had breakfast and Dr. Patel has examined you." Eleanor's guard immediately rose. "I don't need a doctor." "It's standard for all household staff and guests," Mrs. Collins replied smoothly. "Nothing invasive, just a general wellness check. I'm not sick." "Of course not. But Mr. Blackwood insists on establishing a baseline for your health. 3 months of intensive training can be taxing." Elena wanted to refuse, but recognized the futility. This was Alexander's world. She was merely passing through it. "Fine," she conceded, "but I want to know exactly what information will be shared with Mr. Blackwood." After a breakfast of fresh fruit, yogurt and coffee that tasted better than anything Elena had consumed in years, Dr. Patel arrived, a petite woman with kind eyes behind tortoise-shell glasses. Her examination was thorough but respectful, and, when finished, she spoke candidly. "You're suffering from mild malnutrition and vitamin D deficiency, which isn't surprising given your circumstances. Some minor respiratory issues that should clear up now that you're in better conditions. Otherwise, you're remarkably healthy, Ms. Ward." By 10 o'clock, Eleanor had been provided with clothing, simple but high-quality pieces that fit surprisingly well. She descended the stairs to find Alexander in his home office, surrounded by screens displaying market figures and news feeds. He rose when she entered, his expression registering subtle approval at her transformed appearance. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than a park bench," Elena replied. Alexander gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Let's discuss the parameters of our arrangement." "Let's discuss why you really brought me here," Elena countered, remaining standing. "And don't insult my intelligence with fairy tales about charity." "Fair enough." Alexander leaned against his desk. "I made a wager with an associate. I bet that I could transform someone from your circumstances into a person who could navigate high society convincingly. And I'm the lucky lab rat. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. You receive shelter, education, and a significant sum upon completion. I win my bet." Elena's jaw tightened. "What's at stake?" "A piece of real estate. I want nothing that need concern you. Everything about this situation concerns me." Eleanor finally took the offered seat. "So you'll teach me to talk properly, dress appropriately, and pretend I belong among the wealthy." That's a simplistic overview, but essentially correct. Alexander handed her a tablet. "This is your schedule for the next 12 weeks. Diction lessons, deportment, dance, cultural literacy, current events, fashion consultation. Every aspect of the transformation. Elena scrolled through the meticulously planned days, each hour accounted for. "Prison with better food," she murmured. "You're free to leave whenever you wish," Alexander reminded her, "though I'd prefer you didn't waste both our time by starting something you won't finish." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I finish what I start, Mr. Blackwood. Always." Something in her tone made Alexander study her more closely. There was a certainty in her demeanor that didn't align with someone who had been living on the streets. Her core of steel beneath the vulnerability. "Your first appointment is with Madame Fournier at 11, he said after a moment. "She'll assess your posture and movement." "And if I fail these assessments?" "You won't," Alexander said with complete confidence. "I chose carefully." The following days unfolded in a whirlwind of lessons and evaluations. Madame Fournier, a former ballet dancer with the posture of a queen and the temperament of a drill sergeant, worked with Elena on walking, sitting, standing, the language of the body that silently communicated belonging or otherness. Professor Jenkins, a linguistics expert from Columbia, tackled Elena's speech patterns, though he expressed surprise at her starting point. "Your diction is already quite refined," he told her during their first session. "Regional influence is minimal. We'll focus on expanding vocabulary and perfecting the subtle inflections of old money." Alexander received daily reports, but attended few sessions in person. When he did observe, Elena noticed his surprise at her rapid progress. What he couldn't know was that she spent nights studying beyond the assigned materials, pushing herself harder than any of her instructors. 2 weeks into her stay, Alexander found Elena in the library at midnight, surrounded by books on art history, political science, and international relations. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked from the doorway. Elena barely glanced up. "Just making sure I don't embarrass you in front of your friends." Alexander entered the room, noting the organized chaos of her study method. Sticky notes marking pages, a notebook filled with her precise handwriting, digital flashcards on her tablet. "You're exceeding expectations," he admitted, taking a seat across from her. "Professor Jenkins says you've mastered pronunciations that usually take months to perfect." Elena finally looked at him, her amber eyes reflecting the warm library light. "I'm a quick study." Evidently, Alexander picked up one of the books, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. "This isn't on your curriculum." "I find her interesting," Elena reclaimed the book. "A woman who created her own power in a world designed to limit her." Alexander studied Elena with renewed interest. Each day, as layers of hardship fell away, something unexpected emerged. Not just beauty, which he had anticipated, but complexity, intelligence, depth, the nagging sense that the woman before him was not being transformed, but rather revealed. 6 weeks into Elena's transformation, Alexander hosted a small dinner party, a test run before her grand debut at the Metropolitan Gala. The guests included James Harrington and his wife, Sophia, 2 senior executives from Black Edge Industries, and tellingly, Vincent Keller. Elena entered the dining room in a midnight blue dress that complemented her now healthy complexion and auburn hair, styled in elegant waves. Gone was any trace of the woman from the Bronx street corner. In her place stood someone who moved with quiet confidence, her posture impeccable without appearing stiff. "Eleanor, allow me to introduce Vincent Keller," Alexander said, watching both their reactions carefully. "Vincent, this is Eleanor Ward." Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly as he took her offered hand. "A pleasure, Ms. Ward. Alexander mentioned he had a house guest, but he failed to mention how charming you would be." "Mr. Blackwood is known for his strategic omissions," Eleanor replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's lovely to meet you, Mr. Keller." Throughout dinner, Vincent observed Elena with increasing scrutiny. She navigated the multiple courses with ease, contributed thoughtfully to discussions ranging from the latest Supreme Court decision to the controversial exhibition at the Whitney Museum, and deflected personal questions with graceful deflection. When the women excused themselves after dessert, Vincent turned to Alexander. "Impressive," he conceded, swirling brandy in his snifter. "Where did you find her?" "Where we agreed I would," Alexander replied smoothly, "though I'm surprised you ask, considering you were watching that night." Vincent's expression remained neutral. "Insurance needed to verify you weren't cheating by recruiting an actress or some down-on-her-luck socialite. Your lack of faith wounds me," Alexander said dryly. "The transformation speaks for itself." "Transformation implies change," Vincent mused. "But I'm not convinced you've changed much about Ms. Ward at all. There's something familiar about her." Alexander tensed imperceptibly. "Meaning?" "Nothing specific, just an observation." Vincent set down his glass. "The Met Gala will be the true test, of course. My sources tell me Senator Campbell and his wife will be attending, along with at least 3 European ambassadors." "Eleanor will handle it beautifully," Alexander said with more certainty than he felt. It wasn't Eleanor's abilities he doubted. It was Vincent's intentions. Something in his old friend's manner tonight had set off warning bells. When the evening concluded and the guests departed, Eleanor remained in the living room, removing her earrings with a sigh of relief. "Well?" Alexander asked, pouring himself a nightcap. "Your assessment? Mr. Harrington is genuinely intelligent. His wife pretends not to be, which is its own kind of intelligence in your world." Elena kicked off her heels. "The executives are terrified of you, but hide it well. And Mr. Keller," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Keller was studying me like a specimen under glass. I'm guessing he's the one you made the bet with." Alexander nodded, impressed by her perception. "Vincent and I have a complicated history. We've been competitors as often as allies. Yet you trust him enough to make high-stakes wagers." Eleanor stretched her feet, wincing slightly. "The shoes are exquisite torture devices, by the way." "Beauty often requires discomfort," Alexander remarked, then immediately regretted the platitude. Elena's look of disdain confirmed his misstep. "That's precisely the kind of nonsense people with power tell those without it to keep them uncomfortable," she said. "But to return to Mr. Keller, he doesn't want you to win this bet. In fact, I'd say he's actively hoping for failure." Alexander stared at her, struck again by her insight. "What gives you that impression?" The questions he asked were designed to trip me up. His eyes when I successfully navigated them, and the way he kept watching you when you weren't looking. Elena stood, gathering her things. "Whatever history you share, it's not friendly competition, it's personal." Long after Elena had gone upstairs, Alexander remained in the living room, troubled by her assessment. Vincent had been his oldest friend, despite their occasional business rivalries. The idea that Vincent might actively sabotage him seemed far-fetched, yet Elena's observations aligned with his own unease. The following morning, Alexander was called away to an emergency board meeting, a potential hostile takeover attempt of one of Blackedge's subsidiaries. He left Mrs. Collins with instructions to continue Elena's scheduled lessons in his absence. 3 days later, exhausted but victorious in fending off the corporate attack, Alexander returned home past midnight. The house was quiet, the staff retired except for Marcus, who had picked him up from the airport. "How is Miss Ward?" Alexander asked as they entered. "Progressing well, from what Mrs. Collins reports," Marcus replied, "though she received a visitor yesterday that caused some disturbance." Alexander frowned. "What visitor? I left explicit instructions." "Mr. Keller, sir. He insisted it was urgent business concerning your shared investment." A cold feeling settled in Alexander's stomach. "And he spoke with Elena?" "Briefly, I believe. Mrs. Collins didn't provide details." Alexander dismissed Marcus and headed immediately to Elena's suite, propriety be damned. He knocked sharply on her door, relieved when she answered quickly, still dressed despite the late hour. "You're back," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Successful corporate warfare." "What did Vincent want?" Alexander demanded, foregoing. "Pleasantries." Elena's expression closed. "Hello to you too. Shouldn't you ask your friend what he wanted?" "I'm asking you." Elena studied him for a moment, then sighed. "He brought documents he claimed you needed to sign immediately. Mrs. Collins was reluctant to disturb my lesson with Professor Jenkins, but Mr. Keller was..." insistent. "And?" Alexander prompted when she paused. "And we had a brief conversation while Mrs. Collins went to find a pen." Eleanor crossed her arms. "He seemed very interested in my background, my relationship with you, my progress." "What did you tell him?" "Exactly what you've instructed me to say, that we met through your foundation's outreach program, that you're helping me rebuild my life after some personal setbacks." Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm quite good at reciting scripts now, Alexander." He caught the edge in her voice. "Something else happened." Elena's eyes met his, challenging. "He offered me money. $100,000 to be exact." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. "For what?" "To disappear. To walk away from whatever arrangement we have." Eleanor's voice was steady, but her fingers twisted together, betraying her tension. "He said you'd grow tired of your project soon enough anyway, that your attention span for charity cases is notoriously short." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "And your response?" "I declined, obviously. I'm still here." Elena turned away, moving to the window. "But it made me wonder what exactly I've stepped into beyond a simple wager. There's history between you two that you're not sharing." Alexander hesitated, weighing truth against discretion. "Vincent and I grew up together. Our families moved in the same circles, expected us to follow similar paths. I chose differently, built something from nothing instead of managing old money. He's never forgiven me for succeeding beyond his family's legacy. So I'm just a pawn in your ongoing rivalry," Elena concluded flatly. "No," Alexander said with unexpected force. "You were meant to be, perhaps, but you're not." Elena turned back to him, her expression guarded. "What am I, then?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to address. Alexander stepped closer, stopping, when he noticed her subtle withdrawal. He began, then regrouped. "You've become important to me, beyond the bet." "Don't," Elena said softly. "Don't confuse your investment with actual feeling, Alexander. I've seen too many men mistake ownership for affection." The indictment stung because it contained a kernel of truth. Had he begun to think of Elena as belonging to him in some way? Had his determination to win transformed into something more possessive? "I don't own you," he said finally. "As you've repeatedly pointed out, you're free to leave whenever you choose. Yet you'd consider it a betrayal if I did." Her insight was uncomfortably accurate, because despite your protestations, this is still about winning for you. Alexander had no ready answer. Business had always been straightforward: identify goal, develop strategy, execute without emotion. But Elena defied such linear thinking. She had become a variable he couldn't calculate, a factor that shifted his equations in unpredictable ways. "The Met Gala is in 3 weeks," he said instead. "After that, regardless of the outcome, you'll receive the promised payment and can chart your own course." And if I wanted to leave now, it wasn't a threat, merely a hypothesis. Alexander met her gaze steadily. "I would drive you anywhere. You wanted to go? Set you up in accommodations of your choosing, and ensure you had sufficient funds to start over. But I would ask, not demand ask, that you consider staying." "Why?" "Because I believe we have unfinished business, you and I." Alexander moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "And because I think you're as curious as I am about how this story ends." After he left, Elena remained at the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky. Her fingers traced patterns on the glass as fragmented memories surfaced. A childhood bedroom with similar views, hushed adult conversations about assets and security protocols, the sudden upheaval of everything familiar. On her bedside table lay a small leather notebook, its pages filled with her precise handwriting. Not notes from her lessons, but something far more consequential. A record pieced together from newspaper archives, database searches conducted during her computer literacy classes, fragments of a past deliberately buried but never quite forgotten. If Alexander thought Vincent was his only problem, he was gravely mistaken. The real revelation was still to come, and when it did, it would reshape everything between them. The night of the Metropolitan Gala arrived with all the anticipation of a Broadway opening. For Alexander, it represented the culmination of a 3-month gamble, one that had evolved far beyond its original parameters. For Eleanor, it was the final act in a performance she had been rehearsing her entire life, though Alexander didn't yet realize this. "Are you ready?" Alexander asked, adjusting his bow tie as he waited in the mansion's grand foyer. The question hung in the air for several moments before Eleanor descended the staircase. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. She wore a gown of deep emerald, silk that seemed to change hues with every movement, catching and reflecting light like the surface of a mysterious sea. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant updo, exposing the graceful line of her neck and the teardrop diamond earrings that had once belonged to Alexander's mother, a last-minute addition he had insisted upon. "You look—" Alexander paused, searching for words adequate to the vision before him. "Presentable?" Eleanor supplied with a slight smile. "Transcendent," he corrected. "Vincent doesn't stand a chance." A shadow crossed Elena's face at the mention of Vincent, but she quickly composed herself. "Shall we? I'd hate to be fashionably late to my own examination." In the limousine, Alexander briefed her one final time on the key figures they would encounter: the power brokers, the tastemakers, the gatekeepers of New York society. Elena listened attentively, though Alexander had the distinct impression she was humoring him. "You don't need to worry," she said finally, interrupting his description of a particularly influential magazine editor. "I've studied everything in your dossiers twice." "It's not about facts," Alexander cautioned. "It's about belonging. These people can smell an imposter." Elena's amber eyes met his directly. "Then it's fortunate I'm not one." Before Alexander could probe this cryptic comment, the limousine arrived at the Metropolitan Museum's grand entrance. Camera flashes exploded around them as they stepped onto the red carpet, Elena's hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm. "Alexander Blackwood," called a reporter. "Is this a new romance?" Alexander deflected with practiced charm, guiding Elena past the media gauntlet and up the museum steps. At the entrance, Vincent Keller awaited them, resplendent in white tie, his expression a careful mask. "Alexander, Ms. Ward." Vincent nodded to each of them. "How lovely to see you again." "Vincent," Alexander acknowledged coolly, "I believe you know most of the attendees. Perhaps you'd care to introduce Elena around." It was a calculated move, forcing Vincent to participate in Elena's debut rather than observe from a distance. Vincent's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "It would be my pleasure," he replied, offering Elena his arm. "Shall we begin with the Astors? They've just arrived." Alexander watched as Vincent led Elena into the crowd, anxiety twisting in his gut despite his outward confidence. He knew Vincent would introduce her to the most intimidating, judgmental members of society first, hoping to see her falter. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that Elena was not merely surviving, she was thriving. She charmed the notoriously prickly Countess de Rossi with a perfectly pronounced comment about Venetian glass restoration. She engaged Senator Campbell's wife in a thoughtful discussion about education reform that drew others into their conversation. When the prima ballerina from the New York City Ballet mentioned an obscure Russian composer, Elena not only recognized the reference, but added an insightful observation about his influence on modern dance. Alexander circulated nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but giving Elena space to prove herself. As he watched her navigate the glittering throng with seemingly effortless grace, he felt a surge of emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, but also something deeper, more unsettling. "Your protégé is quite the revelation, James," Harrington commented, appearing at Alexander's side with 2 champagne flutes. "Vincent looks like he swallowed something unpleasant." Alexander accepted the champagne, his eyes still tracking Elena. "She's exceeded all expectations." James studied his friend thoughtfully. "And created some new ones, I suspect. This stopped being about the bet weeks ago, didn't it?" Before Alexander could respond, A commotion near the bar caught their attention. Vincent had cornered Elena away from the main crowd, his posture aggressive despite his lowered voice. Alexander moved swiftly to intercept, catching only the tail end of Vincent's words. "Know exactly who you are." Elena's face had paled beneath her perfect makeup, but her voice remained steady. "Then you understand why you should reconsider your approach, Mr. Keller." "Is there a problem?" Alexander asked, placing himself subtly between them. Vincent stepped back, smoothing his expression. "Not at all. Ms. Ward and I were just discussing her remarkable adaptability. It's almost as if she was born to this world." The emphasis on born sent a chill down Alexander's spine. Vincent knew something, or thought he did. "If you'll excuse us," Alexander said firmly, guiding Elena away. "I believe the governor was hoping to meet you, Elena." As they moved through the crowd, Elena's composure never wavered, though Alexander could feel the tension in her arm beneath his hand. "What did Vincent say to you?" he murmured. "Nothing of consequence," Elena replied, her smile fixed in place. "For onlookers, though I believe your friend has been doing some research on me." "Tell me," Alexander insisted. "Later." Elena squeezed his arm in warning as they approached the governor and his entourage. "Your bet is not yet won, Alexander." The remainder of the evening unfolded without further incident. Elena performed flawlessly, drawing admiring glances and approving nods from even the most discriminating socialites. By the time they departed, there could be no question. Alexander had won his wager decisively. In the limousine returning to the mansion, Eleanor finally allowed herself to relax, slipping off her stiletto heels with a sigh of relief. "You were magnificent," Alexander said quietly. Eleanor gazed out the window at the passing city lights. "Was I worth the investment?" "You know you were." Alexander hesitated. "But I need to understand what Vincent was implying. What does he know about you that I don't?" Elena turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps you should ask what you know about Vincent that I don't." "What does that mean?" "It means I'd like to return to the house before we have this conversation." Her tone was final. When they arrived, Elena excused herself to change out of her gown. Alexander poured himself a scotch in the library, his triumph at winning the bet overshadowed by growing unease. Something was terribly wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint what. His phone buzzed with a text from Vincent. "Congratulations. The property is yours, but you've lost something far more valuable than you realize. Check her background thoroughly." Before Alexander could process this cryptic message, Elena reappeared in the doorway, now dressed in simple black pants and a silk blouse, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. "I believe we need to talk," she said. "Yes," Alexander agreed, setting down his phone, "starting with who you really are." Elena moved to the library table where Alexander's tablet lay. "May?" "Hi." At his nod, she picked it up and tapped the screen several times before handing it back to him. On the display was a news article from 13 years earlier, the headline bold against a grainy photograph. "Montgomery Tech heir presumed dead after family assassination." Alexander stared at the image, a teenage girl with familiar amber eyes, standing beside her parents at a charity gala. The caption read, "Elizabeth Montgomery, 16, with parents Robert and Catherine Montgomery before the tragic incident that claimed their lives." "Elizabeth Montgomery," Alexander whispered, looking up at Elena. "No, Elizabeth," with dawning comprehension. "The Montgomery family massacre. Everyone thought you died with your parents." "That was the idea," she replied calmly. "When someone systematically eliminates your entire family for control of a tech empire worth billions, disappearing seems the wisest course." Alexander's mind raced, connecting pieces that had been before him all along. Her natural refinement, her ease with the cultural references, her inexplicable knowledge of upper-class protocols. "But that would mean—" He trailed off, the implications staggering. "That means Vincent Keller's father orchestrated my family's destruction," Elizabeth completed the thought. "And Vincent himself helped cover it up." Alexander felt as if the floor had dropped beneath him. That's impossible. I've known Vincent since we were children." "And I've known the truth since I was 16, Elizabeth countered. When my parents' private jet mysteriously malfunctioned, I wasn't on board as reported. I was home with strep throat. My father's head of security got me out before the Kellers could confirm I was dead too. But why? Alexander asked, struggling. To reconcile this revelation with the man he thought he knew. Why would the Kellers target your family? Montgomery Tech was developing quantum encryption technology that would have revolutionized cybersecurity. Keller Industries wanted it, badly. When my father refused to sell, they took more drastic measures. Elizabeth's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. They made it look like corporate espionage gone wrong. The investigation was suspiciously quick and superficial. Alexander collapsed into a chair, the enormity of her revelation overwhelming him. You've been hiding for 13 years, living on the streets. Not always, Elizabeth said, pacing the library. I spent years in Europe under an assumed identity, finishing my education. I came back to the States 3 years ago to gather evidence. Living on the margins made me invisible, the perfect vantage point to observe without being observed. And then I found you, Alexander said hollowly, because of a stupid bet with the son of the man who destroyed your life. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. Ironic, isn't it? When you approached me that night, I thought you were working for Vincent, that he'd somehow discovered I was alive and sent you to lure me out. Why didn't you run? I considered it, she admitted, but then I realized, what better way to get close to Vincent Keller than through his oldest friend? I saw an opportunity, and took it. The words struck Alexander like physical blows. So this was all, what, a counter scheme? You used me to get to Vincent? Elizabeth hesitated, conflict evident in her face. That was the plan, initially. And now? Alexander demanded, anger beginning to replace shock. Before she could answer, Alexander's phone buzzed again, another text from Vincent. She's played us both, Alex. Meet me at the club. We need to talk. Alexander showed Elizabeth the message, watching her face carefully. Did you play me, Elizabeth? Was everything between us a lie? Not everything, she said softly. That's what makes this so complicated. Alexander stood, suddenly needing distance. I need to think, to process this. Alexander, please, I'm going to meet Vincent, he cut her off. I need to hear his side of this. Elizabeth's eyes widened in alarm. You can't. If he knows, I'm alive, I'm in danger. He already knows, Alexander pointed out, and I need answers. Then I'm coming with you, Elizabeth insisted. No, Alexander was firm. I need to do this alone. You'll be safer here with security. Elizabeth grabbed his arm. Alexander, listen to me. Vincent isn't who you think he is. If he realizes you're turning against him, I just need to talk to him, Alexander pulled away. I've known him my entire life. If what you're saying is true, I deserve to hear him admit it. And if I'm not here when you return, Elizabeth challenged. Alexander looked at her, the woman who had somehow become the center of his world in just 3 months, a woman he now realized he didn't know at all. That would be your choice, he said finally. But I hope you'll wait, for both our sakes. After Alexander left, Elizabeth stood alone in the vast library, her careful plans unraveling around her. She hadn't anticipated the one variable she couldn't control, her own heart. Somewhere along the way, the man she'd intended to use as a pawn had become something else entirely. She moved to Alexander's desk, quickly accessing his private files. If she was right about Vincent, Alexander was walking into terrible danger. She needed proof, something concrete to convince him when he returned. If he returned. The thought sent a chill through her. Elizabeth had spent 13 years surviving, planning, hiding. She had learned to trust no one, to expect betrayal at every turn. But now, faced with the possibility of losing Alexander, not to deception, but to Vincent's vengeance, she finally understood what she had been fighting for all along. Not just justice, not just survival, but the chance to live again, to love again, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. With renewed determination, Elizabeth began searching Alexander's files, looking for the connection she knew must exist between Black Edge Industries and Keller's corporate empire. The evidence that would save Alexander, if only she could find it in time. The Astor Club loomed before Alexander, its distinguished facade unchanged from the night this entire saga began. Inside, the same amber lighting cast shadows across mahogany paneling. The same crystal glasses gleamed on the bar. Yet Alexander felt like a different man entirely, inhabiting a world that had shifted on its axis. Vincent waited in their usual private room, a tumbler of scotch already in hand. Another glass sat waiting. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Vincent said, his voice deceptively casual. Alexander remained standing. "You've been keeping secrets, Vincent." "We all have secrets," Vincent replied. "Elizabeth Montgomery's existence, being chief among them in your case." "How long have you known?" Vincent swirled his drink. "I suspected something the first night you brought her to dinner. There was something familiar about her, a ghost of someone I'd once known. It took some digging to confirm my suspicions." "And did you also confirm what happened to her parents?" Alexander asked, his tone dangerously quiet. Vincent sighed theatrically. "She's filled your head with conspiracy theories, I see. The Montgomerys died in a tragic accident. The investigation was thorough." "The investigation was a whitewash," Alexander countered. "I checked on my way here. The lead investigator suddenly retired to a villa in Monaco 3 months after closing the case, a villa purchased through a shell company linked to Keller Industries." Something cold flashed in Vincent's eyes. "You should be careful about making accusations you can't substantiate, Alex. It's not good business." "This isn't about business," Alexander replied. "It's about murder. It's about a 16-year-old girl who lost everything and had to vanish to stay alive." Vincent set down his glass, all pretense of cordiality evaporating. "It was a different time. My father made certain decisions to secure our family's future. Decisions I didn't know about until years later." "So you admit it," Alexander said, disgust evident in his voice. "I admit to protecting my family legacy," Vincent replied coldly. "The same way you would, the same way anyone in our position would." "You're wrong." Alexander shook his head. "There are lines I wouldn't cross." Vincent laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Says the man who plucked a homeless woman off the street for a bet. Don't pretend you're better than me, Alex. We're cut from the same cloth." The accusation hit its mark. Alexander had used Elizabeth, or thought he had, just as calculatingly as Vincent had covered up her family's destruction. The realization sickened him. "What do you want, Vincent?" he asked wearily. "What I've always wanted." Vincent moved to the bar, refilling his glass with deliberate motions. "The Montgomery quantum encryption technology. Elizabeth is the only legal heir. With her gone, the patents revert to the government and become available for licensing. My father tried to go directly to the source. I've been more patient." A chill ran through Alexander as the full picture clarified. "The bet. You wanted me to find her." Vincent smiled thinly. "I suspected she was still alive. Rumors had surfaced, a woman who matched her description accessing old Montgomery accounts through obscure channels. But she was careful, invisible. I needed someone she wouldn't immediately associate with the Kellers." "So you used me as bait," Alexander concluded, knowing I couldn't resist the challenge. "You've always been predictable in your competitive nature." Vincent sounded almost fond. "And it worked beautifully. You found her, cleaned her up, made her visible again. All I needed was confirmation that it was really her." "And now?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "Now she disappears." "Again," Vincent said simply. "This time permanently. The encryption technology finally comes to market through Keller Industries and you—" "I what?" Alexander's hand slipped into his pocket, activating the recording function on his phone. "You acquire an unfortunate gambling problem," Vincent continued smoothly. "Debts that force you to make poor business decisions. Eventually, black edge. Industries falls apart and I'm there to pick up the pieces at pennies on the dollar." "You've thought of everything," Alexander said, buying time, praying Elizabeth had found what she needed in his files. "I've had 13 years to plan," Vincent replied. "Ever since my father showed me what real power looks like. The Montgomerys were brilliant but naive. They thought principles mattered more than survival. Elizabeth clearly inherited that trait." Alexander's phone vibrated in his pocket. A text. He needed to check it, but Vincent was watching him too closely. "And what makes... You think I'll go along with this plan?" he asked, moving casually toward the bar, creating distance. Vincent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because if you don't, Elizabeth won't be the only one who disappears. Your mother still lives alone. In that big house in Connecticut, doesn't she? Such a remote location." The threat landed like a physical blow. Alexander set down his untouched glass, rage boiling beneath his controlled exterior. "You would threaten my mother?" "I would eliminate any obstacle," Vincent corrected. "Nothing personal, just business. The way you taught me." While Vincent spoke, Alexander managed to glance at his phone. The text was from Elizabeth. "Get out now, proof secured, authorities contacted." "We're done here," Alexander said, moving toward the door. Vincent stepped into his path. "You're not thinking clearly, Alex. Sleep on it. You'll see I'm offering you the best possible outcome under the circumstances. The circumstances being that you're a sociopath who helped cover up multiple murders." Alexander's voice remained steady despite his accelerating heartbeat. "I'll take my chances elsewhere." Vincent's expression hardened. "That's disappointing. Marcus is waiting to drive you home. Perhaps you should reconsider during the ride." Alexander froze. Marcus, his driver for over a decade. "Marcus works for you." "Everyone works for someone," Vincent shrugged. "Marcus has been on my payroll for years, useful for keeping tabs on your activities." The realization that he'd been watched, monitored in his own home, sent ice through Alexander's veins. Elizabeth had been right about everything. "I'll find my own way home," Alexander said, reaching for the door. Vincent's hand shot out, gripping Alexander's arm with surprising strength. "I can't let you do that, Alex. Not until we reach an understanding." The door burst open before Alexander could respond. Two uniformed police officers entered, followed by a woman and man in suits, who immediately identified themselves as FBI agents. "Vincent Keller," the female agent asked. "We have some questions about your involvement in the Montgomery family investigation." Vincent's face drained of color as he released Alexander's arm. "This is a private club. You can't just—" "We have a warrant," the male agent interrupted, producing the document. "And we have evidence of your involvement in obstruction of justice, tampering with a federal investigation, and conspiracy after the fact." As the agents began reading Vincent his rights, Alexander slipped out, heart pounding. The club's main room was now filled with law enforcement personnel, members looking on in shock as computers and files were seized. Outside, a familiar figure waited beside a taxi, Elizabeth, her hair tucked under a cap, her posture tense with vigilance. "Again, how did you—" Alexander began. "No time," she cut him off, pulling him into the taxi. "We need to get your mother. Vincent has contingencies." As the taxi pulled away, Alexander watched his oldest friend being escorted from the club in handcuffs. "What evidence did you find?" "Everything," Elizabeth said grimly. Vincent kept records of every transaction, every bribe, every threatened witness. Blackmail material on his own father. He was building his own power base. "And how did you access it?" Elizabeth's smile was satisfied but tired. "Your companies share cloud storage architecture. You really should improve your cybersecurity." "Alexander." They rode in silence for several blocks before Alexander spoke again. "I'm sorry for everything, for using you for a bet, for not believing you immediately." "I used you too," Elizabeth reminded him. "To get close to Vincent, we're both guilty of manipulation. The difference is your motive was justice, mine was pride." Alexander stared out the window at the passing city lights. "How can I make this right?" Elizabeth considered his question. "Montgomery Tech still exists, on paper at least. The patents are dormant but valid. With the right leadership, the company could be revived." "Your company," Alexander corrected. "Your birthright." "A birthright I have no idea how to reclaim," Elizabeth confessed. "I studied finance and technology, but I've been hiding for so long I don't know how to step back into the light." Alexander turned to face her, seeing not the polished society woman from the gala, nor the street-hardened survivor from the Bronx, but someone new, a complex amalgamation of strength, vulnerability, brilliance, and caution. "I know something. About building companies," he said quietly, "and about second chances." "Are you offering a partnership, Mr. Blackwood?" Elizabeth's voice held a note of challenge. "I'm offering whatever you want," Alexander replied honestly. "My resources, my expertise, my connections, they're all yours. No conditions, no bet, just atonement." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. "I don't want your guilt, Alexander, or your charity." "What do you want?" he asked simply. "Time," she said after a pause. "Time to reclaim my name, to rebuild my life. Time to decide who Elizabeth Montgomery is after 13 years of being someone else." "And us?" Alexander couldn't help asking. "Is there room in that future for whatever this is between us?" Elizabeth's hand found his in the darkness of the taxi. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out." 3 months later, Elizabeth Montgomery held her first press conference as the restored CEO of Montgomery Quantum Technologies. The business world reeled at her miraculous reappearance, at the dramatic story of survival and pursuit of justice. Vincent Keller awaited trial, his father having suffered a stroke upon his son's arrest. The Montgomery patents, finally released from legal limbo, were already revolutionizing cybersecurity worldwide. Alexander watched from the sidelines as Elizabeth handled the press with graceful authority. Blackledge Industries had provided initial funding for Montgomery Tech's resurrection, but Alexander had insisted on a strictly arm's-length arrangement. No controlling interest, no board seat, no special privileges. When the cameras finally departed, Elizabeth found him waiting in her new office. "You did brilliantly," he said. "It feels surreal," she admitted, "speaking publicly as myself after all this time." "Regrets?" Alexander asked. Elizabeth shook her head. "Not about reclaiming my identity, but sometimes I miss the simplicity of that blue guest room. In your house." Alexander smiled at the memory. "Mrs. Collins asks about you constantly." "And what do you tell her?" "That you're exactly where you belong." Alexander hesitated, "though I keep hoping that might eventually include being with me." Elizabeth moved closer, the caution in her eyes gradually replaced by something warmer. "I've spent 13 years hiding, Alexander. Learning to trust again takes time." "I have all the time in the world," he replied. "No more bets, no more wagers, just us." "Us," Elizabeth echoed, testing the word. "I think I could get used to that." When she reached for his hand, it wasn't the carefully choreographed gesture she'd practiced for the gala. It was something real, fragile but genuine, the first tentative step toward a future neither of them had anticipated. In the end, Vincent had been right about one thing. Alexander had indeed lost something valuable the night he made that bet at the Astor Club. He had lost his arrogance, his certainty, his belief that everything and everyone had a price. What he had gained, in return, was infinitely more precious, not a piece of property or a business advantage, but the chance at redemption, the opportunity to help rebuild what had been destroyed, the possibility of love based not on ownership or control, but on truth. As Elizabeth leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, Alexander silently acknowledged the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from winning, but from having the courage to change the game entirely. Fim da Historia. Dear listeners, we hope Elizabeth and Alexander's journey from deception to trust has moved you. Their story reminds us that true transformation comes not from changing others, but from allowing ourselves to be changed by love and truth. If you've enjoyed this emotional tale, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories for you to discover. Just click on the link to your left. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and the power of redemption. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section below.